You don't belong here." The words cracked across the banquet hall like crystal shattering on marble. They came from a woman in scarlet, a white power broker draped in a short sequined dress that glimmered under chandeliers as if she believed the light itself was her ally. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. Dozens of heads turned, forks paused, wine glasses hovered midair. The air shifted. At the far end of the long mahogany table, the target sat motionless, a black woman in a burnt orange gown. No necklace, no diamond tiara. Her hair was pulled tight at the nape, not as decoration, but as discipline, sharp, deliberate, unyielding. The contrast between them was almost cinematic, one spilling noise and glitter, the other radiating silence that pressed harder than sound. The hall had been quiet a moment earlier. Golden cutlery chimed faintly. Violins hummed in the corner. Waiters glided with trays of Bordeaux. But with that sentence, "You don't belong," the room transformed into a stage. Every guest knew it. A play had begun. The woman in red leaned back in her chair, a smirk sliding across her face. She didn't just insult, she performed it, like she was adding another jewel to her crown. She raised her glass, tilted it toward the black woman, and said loud enough for nearby dignitaries to hear, "Some invitations go astray. Surely you understand." And a ripple of nervous laughter flitted along the table, thin, uncomfortable, the kind of laugh people make when they fear silence more than injustice. The black woman did not laugh. She didn't flinch either. Her gaze remained steady, anchored on the stem of her water glass. She inhaled once, slow, almost imperceptible. To anyone watching closely, the stillness was louder than any protest. In that stillness, memories flickered. At 23, standing in a Boston ballroom, turned away at the door, though her name was on the guest list. At 29, denied a seat at a venture gala because founders sit in the back, each scene etched into her bones, not as scars, but as steel. And now here she was again, different decade, same tone. The violins faltered. A young server, no older than 22, froze near the wine station. His hand trembled as he reached for his phone, instinctively pressing record. Somewhere behind him, a pair of donors whispered too loudly, "She's not one of us. Look at her gown. Too plain." The black woman's eyes flicked upward, not to the whispers, not to the phone, to the chandelier itself. Its 100 glass shards caught the light, refracting brilliance everywhere except directly above her seat. A small irony, a reminder. She didn't need borrowed light. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. The woman in red leaned forward again, pressing harder. "You probably snuck in. No leader sits here dressed like that." The insult landed like ash in the air, heavy, coarse, suffocating. Some guests looked down at their plates, refusing eye contact, pretending the roast pheasant demanded their attention. Others glanced toward the head table, waiting for someone important to intervene. No one did. Silence. Then the clink of crystal as the woman in red tapped her glass with a silver knife, commanding the hall like it was hers. "Shall we toast?" she declared. "To real power?" Glasses lifted reluctantly, but not the black woman's. Her hand stayed flat on the table, palm calm, fingers steady. She hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. The weight of her presence was already speaking louder than the chandelier above them all. The woman in red tilted her glass again, the ruby liquid shimmering as though it were another jewel in her crown. Her smirk widened, each curve of her lips crafted for spectacle. Around her, laughter scattered like cheap confetti, thin, brittle, designed to mask unease. "Someone should remind you," she said, her voice dipped in honey but sharpened with glass, "that this seat is reserved for leaders, not strays." The word hung heavy, almost physical, sliding across the polished table like a blade. At the far end, the black woman in orange still did not move. Her palms rested flat on the linen, steady as stone. She looked down briefly at her plate, untouched. The roasted pheasant steamed, but she seemed to see something else in the swirl of rising heat. Another banquet, years earlier. Another table where her presence had been questioned. That memory had burned her once. Tonight, it forged her stillness. Guests exchanged glances. One diplomat cleared his throat, but said nothing. A senator's wife whispered into her husband's ear, eyes darting toward the chandelier as though light itself might shield her from complicity. The hall brimmed with tension, yet no voice cut through, except one. A young man in uniform, a server balancing an empty tray, whispered under his breath, "This isn't right." He thought no one heard, but the black woman's eyes flicked toward him, a silent acknowledgement. His words, fragile as they were, seemed to stitch themselves into the silence, strengthening it. The woman in red caught it too. Her head snapped, eyes narrowing. "Did you say something?" she hissed toward the server. He froze, tray trembling in his hands. His throat tightened. Before he could answer, she dismissed him with a flick of her manicured fingers, like swatting at dust. The humiliation returned to its intended target. "See," she announced, turning back to the table. "Even the help knows you don't belong." The cruelty was deliberate, performed, a spectacle for the room. And yet still the black woman in orange did not respond. Her calmness unsettled the performance. She sat with the patience of a storm waiting at sea, invisible from shore but inevitable. One guest, older and dignified, leaned subtly toward his neighbor. "Do you know who she is?" he whispered. The neighbor shrugged. They didn't. That ignorance was exactly the stage the woman in red wanted. A crowd convinced of her superiority, blind to the truth at the table. Another chuckle rose from the woman in red, this one dripping with the false ease of victory. She set down her glass, leaned forward until the candlelight carved sharp shadows across her features. "Tell me," she said, tilting her head, "whose guest are you? Surely not the host's. No one of consequence would claim you." It was the boldest strike yet public, final, designed to strip dignity in front of every eye. The hall's tension tightened. The violins faltered again, bowstrings squeaking. Somewhere in the distance, a fork clattered to the floor. No one moved to retrieve it. Stillness deepened around the black woman. Her breath was steady, her gaze lowered, not in defeat but in measure. She had let the fire spread, and now she prepared the wind. The woman in red drummed her nails against the stem of her glass. Tick, tick, tick. Each tap was a warning, a prelude. Her eyes scanned the room, relishing the spotlight. The banquet had stopped being about diplomacy hours ago. Now, it was her theater. "You sit there," she said, voice sharp enough to slice the strings of the silent violins. "And you think silence makes you dignified? Number silence makes you invisible." She raised her glass of wine, deep crimson, shimmering under the chandelier, and with a flick of her wrist, tilted it. The liquid cascaded downward. It splashed across the black woman's orange gown, staining the fabric in a brutal crimson bloom. Gasps broke the hall. Knives froze halfway through lamb shanks. Conversations died mid-syllable. The woman in red smiled, wide and vicious. "Now," she purred, "you finally look the part. You match the tablecloth." Laughter didn't come this time, not even the nervous kind. The hall was too shocked, too still. The act had gone beyond words. This was no longer performance. It was assault dressed as humor. The black woman lowered her gaze to the spreading stain. The orange silk drank the red slowly, deliberately, as though marking itself for memory. She didn't flinch, not even a twitch. She lifted her hand, brushed her fingertips lightly against the wet fabric, then set them back on the table. Calm, controlled, unmoved. The young server, still filming, almost dropped his phone. His breath caught audibly, shaking. He whispered again, this time louder, trembling. She just poured it on her." Other guests began to stir. A woman at the far end pressed her hand to her mouth. A man cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The cowardice of silence spread faster than the wine stain. The woman in red leaned back, satisfied, eyes glittering with triumph. She believed she had ended it. She believed humiliation was final. But something shifted. The black woman's eyes rose slow, deliberate. They locked onto the chandelier above. The fractured glass refracted light everywhere, casting spears of gold across the room. And when she lowered her gaze back to the woman in red, her expression had changed. Her stillness was no longer passive. It was coiled, charged, the kind of silence before thunder. One guest, older and wiser, felt it too. He leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Something's about to happen." The woman in red noticed. Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She straightened in her chair, as though bracing. Then, Defiance returning, she snapped her fingers for another glass of wine, her voice dripping arrogance. "Bring me another. This one's finished." The server obeyed, hands trembling as he placed a fresh pour in front of her. The black woman didn't move. She simply inhaled once, exhaled once, and let the room wait. And the room did wait. Every eye, every breath, every flicker of candlelight bent toward her, toward the silence that had transformed from wound into weapon. The wine dripped from her gown in quiet streams, tiny rivers carving their way across silk. The hall seemed to hold its breath. No one dared move. The chandeliers hummed faintly, as though even the light was waiting. The black woman lifted her hand, not quickly, not with anger, with control. She reached for her clutch, small, elegant, orange leather to match her gown. The sequins of the woman in red sparkled beside her, desperate for attention. But the eyes of the hall drifted, slowly, irresistibly, to the hand that now retrieved a phone. Her thumb tapped once. A screen lit her face in pale blue. She typed 3 words. Just 3. Activate Protocol 9. Then she slid the phone back into her clutch. No flourish, no drama. As if it were nothing more than a reminder note to herself. But across the city, things began to move. Assistants in glass towers checked encrypted messages. Lawyers stirred in the middle of dinners. Screens lit up in boardrooms where lights had already been switched off. A single order had been given. The machinery of power shifted its gears. At the banquet table, no one knew yet. All they saw was the woman in orange setting her clutch aside, hands returning calmly to the linen as though nothing had happened. The woman in red chuckled, a brittle sound that echoed too loudly in the cavernous room. "Texting your little friends? Sweet. But it won't save you. Power isn't in your phone. Power is here, in my voice, in this hall." She lifted her glass, her laugh echoing thinly, desperate for an audience. A few forced chuckles answered, but most of the hall remained silent now. Something had shifted. They felt it. The black woman finally moved. She adjusted her chair slightly, the scrape of wood against marble slicing the quiet like a warning. She did not rise. She simply straightened her spine, shoulders settling into perfect alignment. The stain on her gown spread, but she wore it like a banner, not a shame. Her eyes swept the table, not frantic, not angry, steady, calculated. She lingered on the trembling server, still clutching his phone, on the donors averting their eyes, on the senator staring too long into his empty glass. She saw them all, and they saw her. A murmur rippled at the far end. A man whispered, "She's not moving because she doesn't have to." The woman in red noticed the murmur. Her jaw tightened. She leaned forward again, trying to reclaim the center. "Look at her," she spat, voice pitched higher, losing its smooth edge. Sitting there in silence as if silence makes her untouchable. "But you all know better, don't you?" No one answered. The black woman lowered her gaze once more to her wine-stained gown. Her fingers brushed the fabric lightly, tracing the border between orange and crimson. Then she lifted her chin and met the woman in red's eyes for the first time all evening. The room braced. No words yet, no revelation, just the calm before the next strike. The silence pressed heavier than the chandeliers above. Guests shifted in their seats, forks nudging porcelain, glasses clinking without being lifted. No one spoke first, no one wanted to. The air itself seemed to bow to the woman in orange, even as her gown still carried the scar of red wine. She hadn't said a word, and yet the room was listening. At the far end, a diplomat adjusted his cufflinks, leaning to his neighbor. "Do you know who she is?" he whispered, barely audible. The neighbor shook his head. "Nobody important, surely. Otherwise—" His words trailed off. "Otherwise, why would she sit silent while being humiliated? Otherwise, why would no one rush to her defense?" But their logic faltered. They looked again at her posture, at the steadiness in her hands, at the calm that seemed less like defeat and more like patience. Something about it unsettled them. The young server, still filming, glanced around nervously. The video was still recording, the screen glowing faintly in his hand. He knew this footage meant something. He didn't know what yet, but history, he felt, was unfolding, and he would have proof. Meanwhile, the woman in red sensed the drift. She noticed eyes sliding away from her glitter, away from her sequins, toward the still figure she had tried to erase, and it enraged her. "You all see it, don't you?" she pressed, voice louder, sharper. "A pretender at our table, someone who doesn't belong. Silence is not strength. Silence is weakness. She expected laughter, nods, agreement. Instead, she got shifting feet, a cough into a napkin, averted eyes. No one was eager to endorse her cruelty now. The longer the black woman sat composed, the more the red dress looked desperate. One guest, a silver-haired investor, frowned and muttered under his breath, "Weakness doesn't look like that. That looks like control." The woman in red heard the murmur. Her smirk cracked, just a fraction. She lifted her glass again, drinking too quickly, hiding the tremor in her hand. The sequins on her dress caught the light but failed to hold it. For the first time that evening, she seemed small beneath the chandelier's glare. The black woman's gaze swept the room again. Eyes met hers and darted away, but the effect was unmistakable. She had become the center without moving, without speaking. Power had shifted. It was invisible, but palpable, like air thickening before a storm. The young server whispered again to no one in particular, "She's letting her destroy herself," and the hall seemed to agree. The woman in red slammed her glass onto the table, the sound cracking like a pistol shot. Wine sloshed over the rim, dark stains spreading across the white linen. She leaned forward, voice trembling with fury now, not confidence. "Say something, defend yourself, or admit it, you don't deserve this seat." All eyes turned to the black woman, and still she said nothing. She merely exhaled, slow, deliberate, her breath steady enough to still the tremor in the air. Her silence had transformed. It was no longer passive. It was defiance. The banquet was no longer hers to endure. It was hers to command. The woman in red shifted in her chair, her sequins scattering light like broken glass. The silence that had once been her stage now pressed down on her shoulders like weight. She could feel it, eyes sliding, whispers building, authority slipping through her fingers, and she could not allow it. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, nails digging into the linen. "You think silence protects you?" Her voice cracked higher, pitched like a violin string pulled too tight. "Number it condemns you." She snapped her fingers toward a passing waiter. "Another bottle," she barked. Her command rang hollow this time, lacking the effortless authority she once wielded. The waiter hesitated, glancing toward the black woman before obeying. That pause, the smallest crack in obedience, was visible to the whole table. The woman in red saw it, and it burned her. She seized the new glass, swirling the wine too quickly, droplets spotting the tablecloth. "This hall," she declared, "belongs to legacy, to families that built nations, to bloodlines that can trace themselves back centuries, not to newcomers playing dress-up in borrowed silk." The insult echoed. This time, no one even pretended to laugh. The silence had turned against her, a mirror reflecting her venom back at her own face. The black woman in orange remained still. She reached for her water glass, lifted it with precision, and sipped once, the simplest gesture in the world. Yet it carried more authority than every word the woman in red had spat all night. Her restraint infuriated the aggressor. Rage flushed up her neck, staining her skin deeper than her dress. "Look at her," she shouted now, pointing, her voice jagged, desperate. "She won't even speak because she can't, because she's nothing." The outburst shattered the illusion of sophistication she had wrapped herself in. A hostess, a broker of influence, a woman used to commanding rooms with charm and poise, reduced now to a furious figure, yelling across fine china. A senator's wife whispered to her husband, "She's unraveling." He nodded, eyes narrowing. The young server's phone caught everything, the shaking finger, the raised voice, the desperation in her eyes. The lens didn't lie. The power broker was losing her grip. Meanwhile, the black woman remained unflinching. She set her water glass down, fingers light on the stem, eyes level. The stain on her gown spread wider, but she wore it like a badge, not a wound. Her silence had become unbearable not for her, but for the one who tried to shame her. The woman in red slammed her hand on the table, rattling plates, sending cutlery dancing. "Say something!" she screamed. "Prove you deserve this table!" No one moved. No one breathed. The chandeliers flickered, and for a fleeting second, the room looked like a painting. The furious woman in scarlet, glittering and unhinged. The calm woman in orange, still and centered. And around them, a gallery of witnesses frozen between shame and awe. The black woman drew one quiet breath. Her eyes lifted, meeting the woman in red's directly steady, unwavering, unafraid. The silence broke not with her voice, but with the crack of inevitability. Something had shifted. The storm was ready. The woman in red rose to her feet. Her chair screeched against marble, a harsh note that made half the table flinch. Her sequin dress glittered like shards of glass in firelight, but the glitter no longer dazzled. It cut. She snatched her glass again, hand trembling this time, and held it aloft as if it were a torch. "This," she declared, her words slurred not with alcohol but with arrogance, "is what happens when pretenders sneak into our halls, when outsiders take seats meant for legacy." And before anyone could move, she tilted the glass. Wine cascaded again this time, not just over fabric but across the table itself. It splashed against plates, silver cutlery, even onto the white gloves of a diplomat seated beside the black woman. The diplomat recoiled, appalled, his eyes darting toward the hostess with disbelief. Gasps erupted. Someone whispered, "Enough," but no one stopped her. The woman in red leaned closer, voice dropping into a hiss that still carried across the stunned hall. "Look at you. Stained, marked. Nothing you wear, nothing you say will ever change what you are." The cruelty was surgical, meant to scar deeper than fabric. The black woman's gaze dropped once more to the spreading red stain. The wine crept along the orange silk like veins of fire across stone. She touched the edge of it with her fingertips slow, deliberate, then let her hand rest on the table. Her calm was unbearable now. It wasn't weakness, it was judgment, and the room felt it. The senator's wife whispered again, louder this time, "She's destroying herself." The young server's phone shook as he tried to steady his hands. The video was capturing everything, the desperation, the collapse of poise, the storm about to break. The woman in red wasn't finished. Her fury demanded climax. She grabbed the bottle itself, a heavy Bordeaux, and raised it as though to pour the entire contents over her target. The hall froze. The act was no longer insult, it was violence waiting at the rim of a bottle. A voice cracked across the table, sharp with shock. "Stop!" It wasn't the black woman's. She hadn't moved. It was a guest, finally breaking the silence. Others stirred, murmurs swelling into a current of dissent. The power broker's command over the room had fractured completely, but she didn't see it, or maybe she refused to. Her hand hovered, bottle tilted, face twisted with rage. "Say something!" she shouted. "Defend yourself!" And then finally the black woman moved. Slowly, with the precision of inevitability, she rose from her chair. The scrape of wood against marble echoed louder than the shouts. She stood tall, the wine stain blazing across her gown like battle paint. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at the woman in red, and the room stilled with her. The bottle in the hostess's hand wavered, the strength in her grip faltering under that gaze. For the first time all evening, the silence belonged entirely, unquestionably, to the black woman. The black woman stood fully now, her figure framed beneath the chandeliers, the orange gown scarred by crimson but radiant all the same. The hall felt smaller, as though every wall had moved closer. Every gaze locked on her. She didn't look at the stain. She didn't look at the bottle trembling in the other woman's grip. She looked only at her eyes. Steady, sharp. "You're finished," she said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they carried clearer than the clink of glass, stronger than the violins that dared not play. They were not a threat. They were a verdict. The woman in red let out a brittle laugh, desperate to reassert control. "Finished? You think a whisper can erase me? You don't even belong at this table." The black woman finally turned, letting her gaze sweep across the hall. One by one, guests straightened under her eyes, as though standing trial. Diplomats, senators, heirs, investors, all felt the weight of her silence turning into speech. "I didn't sit here to belong," she said, voice even. "I sat here because I built this table." Gasps rippled down the long stretch of mahogany. Silverware clattered from someone's trembling hand. The woman in red blinked, her smirk faltering. What are you talking about?" The black woman reached for her clutch once more, lifting her phone. She tapped the screen, and it glowed. She didn't show it to the room. She didn't need to. "Protocol 9, she said calmly. "While you were spilling wine, I was ending contracts. $12 billion terminated." The words detonated in silence. A senator yodeled upright. "12 billion?" he echoed, voice cracking. The woman in red shook her head violently, as though trying to scatter the truth. "You're bluffing. You're nobody." The black woman tilted her head, expression unreadable. "Then why do your investors' phones keep lighting up?" And as if on cue, A dozen vibrations broke out along the table. Guests glanced down at glowing screens, brows furrowing, eyes widening. Notifications poured in, contracts suspended, funding withdrawn, assets frozen. A chain reaction of collapse in real time. The room erupted in whispers. Panic. Disbelief. The woman in red's hand shook harder, the bottle wobbling. "No, this isn't possible," she stammered. You can't." "I already did," the black woman cut in, her tone sharp but measured. "Because you mistook silence for weakness. You mistook dignity for absence. And you mistook me for someone who would bow." Her words reverberated like thunder rolling over mountains. Guests leaned forward, riveted. Some nodded subtly, others whispered to neighbors, their eyes darting between the woman in orange and the woman unraveling in red. The balance of power had shifted. The young server filming whispered in awe, "She's not defending herself, she's dismantling her." And still, the black woman hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. For the first time, the chandeliers above seemed to shine directly on her, light catching the defiant blaze of orange through the wine's scar. The storm had broken. The hall erupted in chaos. Crystal clinked against china as guests scrambled for their phones, faces lit by the cold glow of incoming alerts. Contracts terminated, deals frozen, board meetings summoned at midnight. The ripples spread faster than fire through dry grass. A senator swore under his breath, his hand shaking as he scrolled. An ambassador muttered, "Impossible. No one has that kind of leverage." A hedge fund heir pushed back his chair so abruptly it toppled, eyes wide as numbers bled across his screen. At the center of it all, the woman in red swayed. Her sequins still caught the light, but their glitter felt grotesque, now costume jewelry on a stage collapsing around her. She clutched the Bordeaux bottle like a lifeline, her knuckles pale. "No," she whispered, voice thin. "This is a bluff, a trick." But the phones kept buzzing. Notifications kept piling. The truth was undeniable. The black woman stood tall, her hands at her sides, her posture unshaken. She did not gloat. She did not rush. She let the room witness the unraveling for itself. The woman in red slammed the bottle down on the table, the thud cracking like a gunshot. Wine spilled, racing across linen, dripping onto the marble floor. "You think you can humiliate me?" she shouted, her voice breaking. "You think you can erase me with your silence?" The words tumbled out jagged, stripped of grace. Her performance was gone. What remained was desperation. Guests recoiled. A diplomat's wife muttered, "She's lost it." The young server's camera shook as he whispered into the mic, "This isn't her banquet anymore. It's hers." The woman in red's eyes darted across the table, searching for allies. None came. Those who had once chuckled at her jokes now avoided her gaze, heads bent to screens or bowed in shame. Isolation wrapped around her tighter than her sequined dress. And still the black woman hadn't raised her voice above calm. She simply said, "I warned you." The words landed heavier than the Bordeaux bottle. A hush fell over the guests. Even the clamor of vibrating phones seemed to fade under the weight of those two syllables. The woman in red staggered back a step. For the first time, fear flickered across her face. Not just fear of losing control, fear of irrelevance, fear of being erased. The black woman took a step forward, not rushed, not threatening, but decisive. The wine-stained silk of her gown trailed softly, regal even in ruin. She looked down the length of the table, meeting every pair of eyes. 12 billion, she said, voice low but steady, is gone tonight, not because of politics, not because of markets, but because arrogance tried to strip dignity in public. The room froze, and in that silence, the chandeliers seemed to burn brighter, as though the light itself had chosen its center. The woman in red's breath came shallow, her chest heaving. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her empire was slipping, not with noise, but with absence. The absence of trust, of money, of respect. The collapse had begun. The hall trembled with whispers, the kind that never returned to laughter. All eyes locked on the woman in orange, her gown streaked with red, her presence towering over sequins and chandeliers alike. She reached again for her clutch. This time, she did not move quietly. She set it on the table with a deliberate weight, the clasp clicking open like the first note of a verdict. The glow of her phone spilled across the linen, brighter than candlelight, colder than the Bordeaux. She scrolled once, then pressed the screen to her ear. The hall still. Every breath seemed to pause. This is her name, she said into the phone, calm, unhurried, icy as marble. Proceed with full termination. All contracts, all holdings, effective immediately. Gasps snapped across the table. A senator half rose from his seat. All? All holdings? She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the woman in red, who now sagged against her chair as though the sequins had turned to lead. Yes, the black woman confirmed. Shut it down. Tonight. She ended the call. No flourish, no slam. Just a press of her thumb, and billions disappeared into silence. The guests erupted in whispers, again furious, frantic. Phones buzzed louder, deals collapsing in real time. A banker clutched his forehead. A donor muttered, "My God, she really has the power." The young server's camera trembled as he whispered, awed, "She just erased 12 billion with a single call." The woman in red's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Her voice, once the blade of the banquet, was gone. In its place, only breathless stammers. You can't! You wouldn't!" she rasped. But the black woman stepped closer, her stained gown brushing the floor, each step echoing with finality. She stood just across the table now, her gaze locked, her voice steady. "You poured wine to shame me," she said. "You raised your voice to erase me, and in doing so, you revealed yourself. Weak, desperate, small." She let the silence punctuate the words before finishing. "And you made the mistake of assuming I needed your table. I own the room." The chandeliers above flared, their crystals scattering light across her face, her gown, her presence. She was no longer a guest. She was the verdict itself, standing in judgment. The woman in red crumbled back into her chair, sequins dull under the glow. Her bottle lay abandoned, dripping red into a spreading pool across the table. The banquet was no longer hers. The room, the night, the power belonged elsewhere now. The banquet hall no longer buzzed with violins or laughter. It pulsed with panic. Guests scrolled feverishly on glowing screens, murmuring fragments of collapsed deals, frozen accounts, vanished billions. Chairs scraped back. Hands shook. The air itself felt thinner. At the head of the table, the woman in red slumped, sequins dulled under the chandelier's blaze. Her power, once effortless, now clung to her like a costume too gaudy for the stage it had lost. A senator stood abruptly, his napkin tumbling to the floor. He looked at the black woman, his voice unsteady but deferential. "If you've truly pulled out your funding, madam, then our committee must speak with you directly. Tomorrow morning, urgently." An ambassador leaned forward, eyes wide with calculation. "And my office. We'll need to reassess immediately." The black woman said nothing. She didn't need to. Their desperation was its own confession. Meanwhile, the woman in red tried to rise, grasping at the edge of the table for balance. "You can't," she began, her voice cracking. "You can't just walk in here and—" "No," interrupted the silver-haired investor seated 2 chairs down. His voice was low, but it carried. He looked at her not with anger, but with dismissal. "You can't walk in here again. Not after this." Gasps flitted across the table. The investor turned his gaze toward the black woman, giving a subtle nod, the kind usually reserved for equals. Others followed. A diplomat adjusted his cufflinks and addressed her with quiet reverence. "Madam, we will adapt. Our portfolios will follow your lead." Each acknowledgement pulled the center of gravity further from the woman in red. Power had shifted, and the room bent accordingly. The young server, still filming, whispered into the phone's mic, "They're all bowing to her now. She hasn't even raised her voice." The woman in red gripped the table harder, knuckles white. "You're all fools," she hissed. "She doesn't belong here. She's nothing." But the words no longer held weight. No one nodded. No one echoed. The sentence fell dead into the air, ignored like static. The black woman finally spoke, her tone measured, quiet enough to force the room to lean closer. "Power isn't in the noise, it's in the choices. Tonight I made mine." Her gaze swept the length of the table. One by one, guests lowered their eyes, not in shame toward her, but in shame of themselves, for watching humiliation unfold too long before finding courage. The chandeliers above flickered, casting shards of gold across the stained orange gown. And in that fractured light, she no longer looked like someone enduring insult. She looked inevitable. The woman in red sagged deeper into her chair, eyes glassy, her empire crumbling around her. She had overreached, and now she sat alone in the ruin of her own making. The banquet hall, once her stage, was now her cage. The banquet was silent now. Not the dignified hush of diplomacy, but the stunned quiet of a verdict delivered. Every guest, every chandelier, every polished surface seemed to lean toward the woman in orange as she rose fully from her chair. Her gown was ruined orange, drowned in crimson, but she wore it like regalia, a battle standard, not a stain. The woman in red slumped in defeat, her sequins dull, her glass toppled, her power evaporated. She tried to speak, her lips trembling, but only silence came. It was no longer her silence to command. The black woman turned her gaze across the hall, sweeping slowly, deliberately. She let each guest meet her eyes, let them feel the weight of dignity they had mistaken for weakness. No one looked away. "Not anymore. You measured me by what I wore," she said evenly, her voice clear but calm. "By what you assumed. By where you thought I didn't belong. And tonight, you discovered the cost of those assumptions." Her words echoed through marble and crystal, carving themselves into the air. She did not shout. She didn't need to. Truth carried louder than any scream. The senator's wife lowered her eyes, ashamed. The silver-haired investor inclined his head once more, deeper this time, acknowledgement bordering on reverence. The black woman gathered her clutch, slipping the phone back inside. She adjusted her shoulders, not the stain. The stain no longer mattered. It was the proof of survival. The badge of fire endured. She stepped back from the table. The scrape of her chair against marble sounded like punctuation final, irrevocable. The young server filming whispered breathlessly, "She turned humiliation into history." As she walked the length of the hall, heels striking steady against stone, guests rose instinctively. Not a rehearsed ovation, not polite courtesy, something heavier. They stood because power had shifted, and standing was the only posture left. The chandeliers above flickered once more, scattering light across her path as though even the room itself bowed in recognition. At the doorway, she paused. She did not turn back to the woman in red. She didn't need to. Her silence was the final blow. Instead, she looked to the room at large and left them with one closing truth. Dignity doesn't shout. It simply ends what insults cannot begin. Then she stepped beyond the doors. The hall behind her remained frozen, a gallery of witnesses, a ruin of arrogance, a testament to power that did not need noise. The banquet was over, and she had already won.